I move on in Ezekiel to Ezekiel 9 through 11, the account of God's glory being removed from Jerusalem. The glory of the Lord is one of the distinctive emphases in Ezekiel. The book as a whole tells the story of how the glory of the Lord was removed from Jerusalem, chapters 9 through 11, and how in the future it will return to Jerusalem, chapter 43. 9 through 11 shows the progressive removal of the glory of the Lord lifted up from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple in chapter 9 and verse 3. At that point he says, "Draw near, O executioners of the city." Those are angelic beings who will carry out God's judgment. Although, of course, it's through the Babylonians that this occurs historically. Each with a destroying weapon in his hand. And at that point, the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub in front of the temple, in front of the Holy of Holies, where it should have been, to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed in linen, whose loins, at whose loins was the writing case. The angels are moving in. God is beginning to move out at this point to the threshold. In chapter 10, he moves from the threshold to the east gate. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple. The temple was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. And then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And when the cherubim had departed, they lifted their wings and rose from the earth in the sight with the wheels beside them, like the vision in chapter 1, I might add. And they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them. Note how the glory of the Lord goes farther from the temple, now all the way to the east gate of the courtyard. But then in chapter 11 and verse 23, the glory of the Lord departs entirely. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain which is east of the city. That would be the Mount of Olives. And so now the glory of the Lord is out of the city entirely. And what's the message? The message is that Jerusalem would fall because the glory of the Lord had departed from it. Say a little bit about Ezekiel 18, an account of individual responsibility. It begins by giving a sour grapes proverb. I found some sour grapes on internet that I have here. It says this, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, What do you mean by using this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, The fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge?" Well, what does that proverb mean? What it means is that they were to blame, or they were getting the blame for what their ancestors had done. The fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. Well, God doesn't like that proverb. "As I live, declares the Lord, you are surely not going to use this proverb in Israel anymore. Behold, all the souls are mine, the soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son. The soul that sins will die." This is emphasizing individual responsibility. But if a man is righteous and practices justice and righteousness and does not eat at the mountain shrines or lift his eyes to idols of the house of Israel or defile his neighbor's wife, if he walks by my statutes and my ordinances so as to deal faithfully, he is righteous and he will surely live. Conversely, he may have a violent son who sheds blood. He will not live. He has committed all these abominations. He will surely be put to death. His blood will be on his own head. But if he has a son who has observed all his father's sins which he committed, and observing does not do likewise, He does not eat at the mountain shrines or do any of these bad things in this long list. If he keeps his hand from the poor, does not take interest or increase, but executes my ordinances and walks in my statutes, he will not die for his father's iniquity. He will surely live. As for the father, because he practiced extortion, robbed his brother, did what was not good among his people, behold, he will die for his iniquity. The point is this, that people are individually responsible for God, and they shouldn't blame their ancestors, their parents, for what comes upon them. The righteous will be justified before God regardless of what their fathers may have done. The wicked will be condemned despite the righteousness of their fathers. And he who turns from his father's evil deeds will be forgiven. And so this clarifies the idea of individual responsibility. You have in the Ten Commandments that the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children to the third and fourth generation. But this should not be taken as denying that God holds us each individually accountable. So that's the passage on individual responsibility. Let me say a little bit about some of the oracles against the nations, particularly the message about the king of Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 28, this middle section, oracles against foreign nations. This passage against the king of Tyre is an example of judgments against various nations, though its exact interpretation is subject to dispute. Here it says, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, say to the leader of Tyre, Thus says the Lord, because your heart was lifted up, and you have said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of gods, in the midst of the sea, and yet you are a man and not God, although you make your heart like the heart of God. Behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There's no secret that is a match for you. By your wisdom and understanding, you've acquired riches for yourself. You've acquired gold and silver for your treasuries. By your great wisdom and by your trade, you have increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you have made your heart like the heart of a god, therefore, behold, I will bring strangers on you, the most ruthless of nations, and they will draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom and defile your splendor. The leader of Tyre's sin is pride. Goes on to say this, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. You had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. And you were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways, from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence. And you sinned, and therefore I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God. And I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings, that they may see you. And by the multitude of your iniquities and the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore I have brought fire from the midst of you. It has consumed you, and I have turned you to ashes on the earth in the eyes of all who see you. The question is, well, who is this figure that's being talked about? And some of the early church fathers wondered if maybe this was Satan. After all, it describes him as a cherub. It says he was in Eden, the garden of God. And of course, the serpent in the Garden of Eden who could be identified as Satan, was there. So is this Satan? Well, the context would suggest that Satan is not here, even though there's some language that alludes back to the Garden of Eden. It is a oracle, a prophecy against the ruler of Tyre, the king of Tyre, a human king. It looks like a funeral lament for him, using highly exalted poetic language. Chapter 26 gave a judgment against the city. Chapter 27 gave a funeral dirge against the city. And then here in chapter 28 is a judgment against its king and a funeral dirge against the king, who lived in a house with a royal garden that reminded people of the Garden of Eden. This, by the way, is similar to the same kind of thing that's in Isaiah chapter 14, where it talks about gives a taunt song against the king of Babylon and how you have fallen from heaven, O shining one, King James Lucifer. There again, it looks like it's a message against a human king and not Satan per se, just as here. And yet you have to admit the description looks like Satan in some ways, drawing on the language of the Garden of Eden, where Satan, as a serpent, plays a role, although he's not there called a cherub. And it's at least possible that there may be an indirect kind of allusion to Satan here, that just as Satan was in that snake in the Garden of Eden, so perhaps Satan is here using the king of Tyre for his purposes. But there's no direct application to Satan. It's at most a hint or an allusion or typology. The direct application is to the king of Tyre. Well, let's move towards the end of the story to the section on the Messiah and the new heart and Ezekiel's temple. But perhaps we should wait till the next video to do that section.